The air inside the Audubon Ballroom was heavy, thick with a tension that felt tighter than a noose. It was a cold Sunday afternoon in Harlem, but there was no peace here. On stage stood a tall man with red hair and glasses, checking his watch, his heart beating the rhythm of a fate he had already accepted. He knew they were coming. Just 1 week earlier, firebombs had shattered his family home while his children slept, a violent message sent not by his enemies in the government, but by the very organization that had raised him. He knew the Nation of Islam was watching. He knew the price of his silence, and he knew the higher price of his voice. When he stepped up to the microphone, the room fell silent, waiting for the fiery words of Malcolm X. But before he could speak his truth, chaos erupted. A scuffle in the crowd, a shout, and then the deafening roar of a sawed-off shotgun. This was not just a political assassination. It was a public execution born from a deep, personal betrayal. As the smoke cleared and the screams began to rise above the confusion, the world was left to wonder. How did the man who demanded respect by any means necessary become the prey of his own people? To understand the man who would eventually shake the foundations of America, you have to look back at the boy America tried to break. Long before the world knew him as Malcolm X, he was simply Malcolm Little, born in 1925 in Omaha, Nebraska. But his childhood was not filled with the innocent games of typical American youth. It was marked by the scent of smoke and the sound of breaking glass. His father, Earl Little, was a preacher, a big, imposing man who dared to speak out for black pride. In the 1920s, that kind of courage was a death sentence. Malcolm's earliest vivid memory was not of a lullaby, but of flames consuming his family home, set ablaze by white supremacists while the police and firemen stood by, watching the wood turn to ash. That night, the boy learned a lesson that would haunt him for decades. The law was not written for people who looked like him. Tragedy didn't just visit the Little family. It moved in. When Malcolm was just 6 years old, his father's body was found nearly severed in half by a streetcar. The authorities called it an accident. The community knew it was murder. This loss was the first domino in a catastrophic collapse. His mother, Louise, a proud woman who tried to keep her 8 children fed on dandelion greens and charity, slowly crumbled under the weight of grief and poverty. The state welfare agents were like vultures, circling closer every day until they finally declared her insane and institutionalized her. The family was shattered. The children were scattered into foster homes. Malcolm Little was effectively an orphan, a ward of the state, taught by his teachers that his only realistic ambition should be carpentry, not law, because he was a nigger. Suffocated by the limitations of the Midwest, the teenage Malcolm fled to Boston and then to the pulsating streets of Harlem, New York. Here, Malcolm Little died, and Detroit Red was born. Detroit Red was everything Malcolm Little could not be. He was flashy, dangerous, and electric. He wore zoot suits with bright colors, straightened his hair with burning lye to look like the white men he secretly envied, and moved through the jazz clubs like a shark in dark water. This was the era of the Lindy Hop and Duke Ellington, but for Red, it was a battleground for survival. He didn't just live in the underworld, he thrived in it. He became a hustler, a pimp, a drug dealer, and the leader of a burglary ring. He carried a pistol and a restlessness that no amount of money could satisfy. For a few wild years, he lived fast, fueled by cocaine and adrenaline, dancing on the razor's edge of death. He was angry at the world, but he didn't know why. He was fighting a war, but he didn't know who the enemy was. He was a product of a system that had denied him dignity, so he sought power in the only way the streets allowed, through fear and crime. But the streets always collect their debt. In 1946, at just 20 years old, the law finally caught up with Detroit Red. He was arrested for burglary and sentenced to 10 years in prison. The judge gave him the maximum penalty, not just for the theft, but because Red had been caught with white women, a social crime far worse than robbery in the eyes of 1940s America. Charlestown State Prison was a tomb for the living. In that cramped, damp cell, the flashy zoot suit was replaced by a gray uniform, and the hustler's pride was stripped away to reveal a hollow, angry young man. The other inmates called him Satan because of his intense hatred for God and the Bible. He paced his cell like a caged panther, cursing the society that had locked him away. But it was in this darkness that a light appeared, not from a window, but from a letter. His siblings wrote to him about a man named Elijah Muhammad, the leader of a mysterious group called the Nation of Islam. They told him that the white man was the devil and that God was black. They told him that his true history had been stolen, his language erased, and his name replaced by the slave masters. At first, Malcolm resisted, but with nothing but time on his hands, he began to read. He read when the library was open, and he read by the faint glow of the corridor light when the guards turned the cell block dark. He devoured books on history, philosophy, and linguistics. He realized that Elijah Muhammad was offering him something he had never possessed, an identity. The transformation was agonizing but absolute. The hustler died in that cell. The criminal faded away. In their place rose a man of fierce discipline and intellect. He stopped eating pork, he stopped smoking, and he bent his knees in prayer to Allah. He began writing letters to Elijah Muhammad every single day, finding a father figure in the man who promised to liberate the black man's mind. When he walked out of prison in 1952, he was 27 years old, but he looked like a man who had lived 100 lifetimes. He was tall, sharp, and focused. He went to the authorities and legally changed his name. He threw away Little, the name of the slave owner who had likely owned his ancestors, and replaced it with the letter X. The X symbolized the unknown African name that had been stripped from his family line. Malcolm X was no longer the boy from Omaha who watched his house burn. He was no longer the street thug Detroit Red who sold his soul for $1. He was a weapon of words, forged in the fire of suffering, ready to serve the Nation of Islam. He was ready to tell white America the truth about itself, and he was ready to wake his people up from their long, painful slumber. If the prison cell was the cocoon, the 1950s saw the emergence of the butterfly, though Malcolm X was a butterfly with a sting that could paralyze a nation. When he walked out of prison, the Nation of Islam was a small, obscure sect with barely 400 members, mostly scattered in Detroit and Chicago. But Malcolm possessed a fire that could not be contained. He didn't just join the movement. He became its heartbeat, its muscle, and its loudest roar. He was appointed as the minister of Temple No. 7 in Harlem, and the streets he once prowled as a hustler became his pulpit. But this time, he wasn't selling drugs. He was selling dignity. He stood on soapboxes on the corners of 125th Street, a tall, imposing figure in a crisp suit, his glasses reflecting the skepticism of the passers-by. He didn't beg for attention. He commanded it. We didn't land on Plymouth Rock, he would thunder, his voice cutting through the noise of the city. Plymouth Rock landed on us. It was a message that resonated like a thunderclap in the souls of black Americans who were tired of turning the other cheek. While the mainstream civil rights movement led by Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. was preaching nonviolence, integration, and love for the oppressor, Malcolm X offered a stark, uncompromising alternative. He didn't want to integrate into a burning house. He wanted to build a new one. He preached self-defense, economic independence, and separation. He told black men that they weren't Negroes, a label given by slave masters, but proud descendants of African kings and queens. Under his tireless leadership, the Nation of Islam exploded. Membership skyrocketed from 400 to estimated 40,000. He established temples across the country, founded the newspaper Muhammad Speaks, and turned the organization into a disciplined economic force. But more importantly, he became the boogeyman of white America. By the late 1950s, Malcolm X was everywhere. He was on television, debating intellectuals and politicians, dismantling their arguments with a razor-sharp wit and a smile that was both charming and terrifying. He was the man the media loved to hate. They called him a hate-monger, a segregationist, a violence inciter. But to the people in the ghettos of Harlem, Chicago, and Los Angeles, he was the only man brave enough to say what they were thinking at the dinner table but were too afraid to whisper in public. He was the angry black man, but his anger was controlled, precise, and justified. He famously declared, "I don't call it violence when it's in self-defense. I call it intelligence." He forced America to look in the mirror, and America didn't like the reflection. Yet amidst all the flashing cameras and roaring crowds, Malcolm remained a humble servant to one man, Elijah Muhammad. To Malcolm, Elijah Muhammad was not just a leader. He was a divine messenger, a savior, and the father he had lost as a child. Every speech Malcolm gave began and ended with praise for the Honorable Elijah Muhammad. He credited the leader with every ounce of his wisdom, every success, and every transformation. He was fiercely loyal, often deflecting praise away from himself. "I am just a ventriloquist dummy," he would say. Elijah Muhammad is the ventriloquist. This dynamic created a powerful duality. Elijah Muhammad was the mystic, the quiet authority in the background, living in a mansion in Chicago. Malcolm X was the warrior, the public face, living on the road, sleeping 4 hours a night, sacrificing his family life for the cause. He recruited the young, the angry, and the famous, most notably the heavyweight boxing champion Cassius Clay, who would soon become Muhammad Ali. At his peak, Malcolm X was the second most sought-after speaker in the United States. He was a phenomenon. He gave the black community a spine of steel. He made them feel that their hair, their skin, and their lips were beautiful. He didn't just change laws, he changed minds. He proved that a man could walk out of the depths of prison and stand toe-to-toe with the most powerful institutions in the world. But success breeds jealousy, and light casts shadows. As Malcolm X's fame grew, eclipsing even that of his teacher, whispers began to circulate within the inner circle of the Nation of Islam. The other ministers were envious of the media attention Malcolm received. They whispered that he was taking credit for the messenger's work. They whispered that he was becoming too powerful. Malcolm, blinded by his loyalty, didn't see the knives being sharpened in the dark. He believed in the brotherhood implicitly. He believed that they were all united in a holy war against oppression. He didn't realize that the organization he had built with his own sweat and blood was slowly turning into a cage. He was at the summit of his power, standing on top of the world, unaware that the ground beneath his feet was already beginning to crack. The higher you climb, the harder you fall, and Malcolm X was about to face a fall that would shatter his world into 1,000,000 pieces. The higher the pedestal, the harder the fall. For Malcolm X, the fall didn't come from a push by his enemies. It came from the crumbling of the ground he stood on. By 1963, the Nation of Islam was an empire, and Malcolm X was its general. But in the shadows of the mosques and the hushed corners of the headquarters in Chicago, a cancer was growing. It started as a whisper, a rumor so vile that Malcolm initially refused to believe it. People said that the Honorable Elijah Muhammad, the man Malcolm revered as a living prophet, the man who preached strict moral codes of celibacy and discipline, was fathering children with his young secretaries. For a man like Malcolm, who lived by a code of absolute integrity, this was impossible. It was blasphemy. But the whispers didn't stop. Driven by a need for the truth, Malcolm met with the women involved. They confirmed the stories. They spoke of a man who used his divine authority to manipulate and exploit them. The realization hit Malcolm like a physical blow. The father figure he had worshipped, the man he had credited with saving his life, was a fraud. This was the first betrayal, and it cut deeper than any knife. Malcolm tried to justify it, tried to find a theological explanation to save his faith, but the bond was severed. He went to Elijah Muhammad in a private, tense meeting. He didn't go to accuse. He went to warn him that the media would find out. But instead of gratitude, he saw a coldness in the messenger's eyes. The son had become a liability. The voice had become too loud. The breaking point came in November 1963 when President John F. Kennedy was assassinated. The entire nation was in mourning. Elijah Muhammad ordered all ministers to remain silent. But when a reporter asked Malcolm X for his thoughts, he couldn't hold back his nature. He described the violence of America, the assassinations of foreign leaders, the brutality against civil rights workers, and said it was a case of the chickens coming home to roost. It was a harsh, unfeeling comment, and the backlash was instant. But for the leadership of the Nation of Islam, it was the perfect excuse. Elijah Muhammad publicly silenced Malcolm for 90 days. Malcolm accepted the punishment with humility, but he soon realized the truth. The suspension wasn't about Kennedy. It wasn't about the comment. It was a permanent exile. He heard from insiders that the order had been given. Malcolm X would not be allowed back. In March 1964, standing alone and vulnerable, Malcolm X announced his break from the Nation of Islam. He was now a man without a country, without a salary, and without protection. He had given 12 years of his life to an organization that now viewed him as a hypocrite worthy of death. But in this void, something miraculous happened. Free from the rigid dogmas of the nation, Malcolm traveled to the Middle East and Africa. He performed the Hajj pilgrimage to Mecca. There, he saw something that shattered his remaining prejudices. Muslims of all colors, from the darkest Africans to the bluest-eyed Europeans, worshiping together in brotherhood. He realized that the racial hatred preached by the Nation of Islam was not true Islam. He wrote a letter back to America that stunned the world. I have eaten from the same plate and drunk from the same glass as fellow Muslims whose eyes were the bluest of blue, whose hair was the blondest of blonde, and whose skin was the whitest of white. He returned to the United States, not as Malcolm X, the angry separatist, but as El-Hajj Malik El-Shabazz, a human rights activist ready to work with other civil rights leaders. He was no longer just fighting for black people. He was fighting for truth. However, the new Malcolm was far more dangerous to his enemies than the old one. To the FBI, he was a potential black messiah who could unite the masses. To the Nation of Islam, he was a traitor who knew their deepest secrets. The atmosphere turned lethal. The secret meeting was no longer just a metaphor. It was a reality. Intelligence reports and later confessions revealed that high-ranking members of the nation were meeting to discuss how to deal with the Malcolm problem. The order was clear. He had to be silenced permanently. The psychological warfare was relentless. He received death threats daily. The phone would ring in the middle of the night with only heavy breathing on the other end. He told reporters, "I live like a man who is already dead." On February 14th, 1965, just 1 week before the end, the threats turned into fire. While Malcolm, his pregnant wife Betty, and their 4 daughters were asleep, Molotov cocktails were thrown into their home in Queens. The house was engulfed in flames. Malcolm ushered his family out into the freezing night, standing in his pajamas as his sanctuary burned to the ground. As he watched the flames, he knew the police hadn't protected him. The press called it a publicity stunt. But Malcolm knew the signature of the attackers. These were the men he had once called brothers. The betrayal was complete. By the morning of February 21st, 1965, Malcolm X was a walking target. He told his team not to search people at the door of the Audubon Ballroom because he didn't want to rule by fear. He walked into that room with his eyes wide open, fully aware that the assassination plot was in motion. He was tired, he was hunted, but he was free, and he was ready to pay the final price for that freedom. When the doctors at Columbia Presbyterian Hospital pronounced Malcolm X dead at 3:30 p.m. on that bloody Sunday, a strange duality swept across America. In the streets of Harlem, there was a wailing, a visceral sound of a heart being ripped from a community's chest. Grown men wept openly on the sidewalks of 125th Street. But in the newsrooms of major papers and the sterile offices of the FBI, there was no grief. There was only a cold, cynical nod of "I told you so." To the mainstream white media of 1965, Malcolm X was not a martyr. He was a monster of his own making. The New York Times, in its editorial the next morning, did not mourn a civil rights leader. Instead, they wrote that he was an extraordinary and twisted man who had turned many true gifts to evil purpose. They called his assassination a case of violence begetting violence, implying that the man who preached self-defense deserved to die by the sword. It was a final attempt to bury his reputation along with his body. The FBI, led by J. Edgar Hoover, watched from the shadows with a satisfaction that bordered on glee. For years, they had tracked his every move, tapped his phones, and infiltrated the Nation of Islam. They viewed him as a threat far greater than Dr. King, because while King appealed to America's conscience, Malcolm challenged America's hypocrisy. In their eyes, the Malcolm problem had solved itself. They closed their files, believing the story was over. But they were wrong. They had underestimated the love the people held for Detroit Red. 4 days later, Harlem staged a farewell that America had never seen before. It wasn't just a funeral. It was a coronation for a fallen king. The Faith Temple Church of God in Christ was packed with thousands of people, while tens of thousands more lined the freezing streets outside. They didn't come to see a demagogue. They came to say goodbye to a husband, a father, and a protector. It was here, amidst the sorrow, that the actor Ossie Davis delivered a eulogy that would rewrite history. Standing over the open casket, looking down at the man the media had demonized, Davis spoke the words that would define Malcolm X forever. Did you ever talk to Brother Malcolm? Did you ever touch him or have him smile at you? Did you ever really listen to him? And we will know him then for what he was and is, a prince, our own black shining prince, who didn't hesitate to die because he loved us so. That phrase, our black shining prince, cut through the lies of the press. It reminded the world that while white America saw a threat, black America saw a shield. Beyond the borders of the United States, the reaction was even more profound. To the world, Malcolm X was not a domestic agitator. He was an international statesman. In Africa, newspapers declared him a martyr for global human rights. In the Middle East, he was mourned as a devout Muslim who had bridged the gap between East and West. He was the first African-American leader to truly connect the struggle in Mississippi with the struggle against colonialism in Africa. He had made the civil rights movement a human rights issue, bringing the case of the American Negro before the United Nations. His death revealed a stark divide in the American soul. To the establishment, he was a cautionary tale. But to the oppressed, he was proof that a man could stand tall even when the whole world told him to kneel. In the years that followed, the narrative began to shift. The publication of the autobiography of Malcolm X gave him a voice from the grave. Readers, black and white, finally heard his story in his own words. They saw the intelligence, the humor, and the profound evolution of a man who was always learning, always growing. The hate-monger label began to peel away, revealing a complex, courageous human being who simply loved his people enough to tell them the ugly truth. The assassination at the Audubon Ballroom didn't silence him, amplified him. The government thought they were extinguishing a fire, but they only scattered the sparks. And those sparks would ignite a new generation of activists, from the Black Panthers to the modern movements for justice. Malcolm X had become bigger in death than he ever was in life. He became a symbol, an icon, and an eternal reminder that the price of freedom is high, but the price of dignity is non-negotiable. In the end, the story of Malcolm X is not a tragedy of death. It is a triumph of transformation. He showed us that a man is not defined by his worst moments, but by his willingness to rise above them. He went from a hoodlum to a prisoner, from a prisoner to a preacher, and from a preacher to a global icon of human rights. He didn't just change his name, he changed his soul. His legacy is not written in the laws he passed, because he was never a politician, but in the spines he straightened. He taught a generation of black Americans to lift their heads, to look the world in the eye, and to demand nothing less than full respect. He forced America to have the uncomfortable conversations it wanted to avoid. He was the mirror that reflected the ugly scars of a nation, and though they broke the mirror, they could not hide the reflection. Today, Malcolm X stands as a testament to the power of the human spirit to evolve. He had the courage to admit when he was wrong, and the bravery to speak the truth even when his voice shook. He knew that the truth is often bitter, but it is the only medicine that cures. Some stories end without closure. The men who pulled the triggers were caught, but the hands that guided them remained in the shadows for decades. Yet, dignity doesn't need applause, and justice doesn't always come from a gavel. It comes from memory. As long as there are people willing to stand alone against the tide, as long as there are voices willing to speak for the silenced, the spirit of Malcolm X remains alive. He is not just a figure in a history book. He is a fire that still burns. To anyone who has ever felt misunderstood, to anyone who has ever had to walk a lonely path because they refuse to compromise their integrity. We see you. Malcolm X walked that path, so you wouldn't have to be afraid of the dark. If this story reminded you of the power of standing up for what is right, please share it. Let's keep the conversation going. And if you believe that the truth is worth fighting for, type any means necessary in the comments below. Thank you for watching.